What's going on, YouTube? It's Adam and Teo again from Kaizen Poker Group. We are today going to be looking at some high stake thread hands from this month and trying to give some analysis for you guys. Sound good, Teo? You ready to go?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. So first hand we have
Is this
here.
what we're starting with here? Ace 8 versus 9s.
Yeah, ace 8 versus
We have,
9s.
yeah, so starts with a pretty standard open on the button at 200, 400. Peter's opening to, just over 2x, just under 2.5x, something like 2.3x. Limitless comes in for a low frequency 3-bet. If you can scroll down, Adam, we can see the sizing he chooses with the ace 8. And Peter's going to have a very standard call in position. I don't see too much of a reason to ever 4-bet this hand, do you?
No, this is going to just be a very frequent call. I mean, there. I think like these mid pocket pairs, nines, eights, sevens, in a game theory sense, have some very small frequency of four bets with the idea of having, set coverage. Well, actually, I think there's multiple reasons going on, but one is having set coverage on the mid boards in your four bet range, and two, having the ability to have bluffs in certain um, high card flops and turns, right? So if our range is just too Broadway heavy, too big pocket pair heavy, if the board comes king queen seven jack 10, well, okay, not a four liner by the river, but double Broadway or triple Broadway, we're going to be lacking hands that we can turn into bluffs. So if we have some mid pocket pairs in our four bet range, then we will have the ability to four bet bluff these board textures.
It seems considerable to have this as a 4-bet. I personally don't really ever find these, but the other thing that you didn't mention that is a benefit to having this as a 4-bet is you can just, like as you can see here, uh, Limitless just has an overcard to these two nines. Like being able to fold that out, just deny a little bit of equity is kind of nice as well. But mainly you're going to be a flat, and that's how Peter decides to play it as.
Yeah, for sure. So here we have Peter flatting. Uh, Flop comes 10-10-4. This texture is going to be quite good for the big blind three better. Now the big blind three better is going to have like a somewhat polarized distribution of hands compared to like the small blind, who's going to three bet more top down, or as we call it, a
Right.
linear range. And the big blind is going to not be interested in three betting some of those more marginal hands like queen 10 suited and queen 9 suited very much, because just closing the action, getting a discount from the big blind is very high EV for that type of strategy. So the big blind three bet range is just going to contain a lot more offsuit trash, or some suited trash as well, like king 5 suited, king 4 suited, king 6
Right.
suited, some wheel aces, some offsuit aces with good blocker effects to the 4-bet range from the imposition player. So
Yeah,
with
that makes sense. Now, but Peter's going to be calling here pretty wide as well, so Limitless will still retain his range advantage even with the uh, heavily polarized range.
yeah, for sure. I mean, this board is not going to connect very much with Peter's nutted region. Yes, he'll have some trips, but other than that, the majority of his range is just like suited broadways and pocket pairs that are.
Should we just take a quick look at the solver and how this spot looks in the flop?
Yeah, for sure. Can do that. So here we have the board for Peter, just to show that it's the same board, and we can see that for Limitless here, his strategy is going to be betting quite a bit. He decides to go for the small size. If we look what he did, you can kind of play like a different sizing here of using some larger bets and checking a little bit more often, which is valid. but also betting fairly frequently for a small size is not never going to be too bad on this type of dry texture, considering you have all these overpair advantage. And even hands such as Ace King are somewhat of a value bet because the imposition player Peter here in this case will continue with Ace Queen and probably Ace Jack versus a small bet. So in a way, Ace King is a value bet. Anything you wanted to
Yeah,
add there?
um, it's generally speaking in these kinds of textures and 3-bet pods, you're never really going to be making a huge error one way or the other just by betting slightly larger, slightly smaller than the solution says. The EV difference is going to be very negligible to the point where there will be little or no regret.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so yeah, basically anything Limitless chooses here as a size is going to be pretty much just fine.
Yeah, I mean, we don't need to get too hung up on the sizing. The idea is that the big blind
Sure.
is going to
He
retain an advantage here.
he bets. Peter does have like somewhat of an interesting decision about whether or not to raise with his nines or just continue as a call. But I think calling is going to be the predominant option he has here.
Yeah, I suspect the imposition will do very little raising because he's just at such a disadvantage, right? So
Yeah, he plays no raises on this board here.
right, yeah.
Yeah.
And if we look quickly at the ranges tab here, if we even just go back to the starting node, you can see that the big blind has an equity advantage here of 51%, but his pot share is greater than his equity percent, so he's going to realize more of his equity than um, his his hot and cold equity of 51%. He's going to over realize it. So his pot share is like pretty good. So when you have this type of situation where his range is already somewhat polarized and he decides to bet, the imposition player is really not interested in finding any raises because
Yeah, one thing that's important to note though is that like when we're facing this small bet and we're in position, we only fold 14%. Like you really have to be careful not to overfold on this flop. It's so easy to have a hand like King 6 suited with a backdoor flush draw and just let it go, but we really can't just fold that hand always. We're gonna have to find some kind of uncomfortable continues. Same thing with these three straights, 10-9, or sorry, Jack-9 or
yeah.
um 9-8. These may be a little bit these may be pretty intuitive if you're like a well-studied player, but if you haven't looked at these spots closely, it might be kind of surprising that these are just like mandatory continues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're going to see very little folding for sure. Very little of the range is interested in folding when it faces a small bet here. It's just your range is doing like you have a lot of hands that have kind of like mid strength equity here, and they're just kind of interested in continuing and potentially over realizing their equity when the out of position player checks on certain turns. So
Yep.
also you need to have some hands that you can potentially bluff by the river. So it's kind of important to have these hands in your calling range. So we get a call here. Turn is a deuce. We could talk about before we look at the solution. Um, Victor decides to take a moment. He checks, which is something he's going to do quite a bit, considering he probably was c-betting most of his range, if not simplifying to a range bet, which probably is okay. I mean, I don't think it's the best strategy, but it could be perfectly viable. If he does so, then he's going to be required to check quite a bit because Peter's range has filtered a little bit, and also his range is already to begin with not super wide. So Victor, with a lot of hands like the one he has here, is not interested in putting a ton of more money into a range that's decided to continue versus his flop C bet. So he's going to check at a pretty high frequency. I would think like globally, if I remember correctly from these situations, we'll be checking somewhere between like 2/3 to half of our range. So maybe something like 60% will be a very common frequency of checks we'll see. Peter,
Yeah, and this is going to play as a pretty intuitive give up, I think. Like we're just going to have better hands to triple off with here.
yeah, for sure. I mean, we have worse hands within our range, and we have better hands that are more interested in betting. Ace eight actually still, as you saw from the previous slide, we got called by king high, jack high, queen high. So like ace eight is kind of in this tier group of hands where it retains some equity and it's beating some of the flop floats from in position. So it's not really interested in turning itself into a bluff. Where if you had something weaker like queen high yourself, jack high yourself, any of like the suited connectors, you'd be interested in barreling again, at least at some frequency. Back to Peter though.
So we go to check, and Peter, yeah,
we have
it's pretty.
Peter deciding to stab here with
He's
nines.
a pretty clear bet, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, nines really benefit from
you could check, but nines is like like you're saying. Sorry, keep cutting you off, but it's going to perform really well as a bet for both equity denial. A lot of hands in Limitless's range here just have one or even two overcards versus your nines, and also we can just get called by worse. Like it's just a nice little value bet here.
Yeah, it's what we kind of call as a hybrid bet. It functions on many different levels. We have worse calling still. We have better potentially. Well, okay, better never folding, so it's not in that value bluff region. But we have definitely worse second call, and we also have hands that have live equity versus us, like king jack. That'll probably be indifferent to continuing, which is like quite nice when they have two live overcards to us. So it's it's just kind of an effective hybrid bet that accomplishes a few things all at once. But I think it's important to note that it's not a mandatory bet, I think, with nines. I don't know if this specific combo is a mandatory bets, but the hand class that's like this, so all your mid pairs like nines, eights, sevens, sixes, you don't have to bet all of them. There is still EV and checking behind and then trying to bluff catch potentially, or the board just going check by the river, and you realizing your pot share. But the mixed incentives make it a kind of a mixed frequency bet. Anything to add there before I go on?
Yeah, I'm just wondering. I think for myself playing checkbacks here, I'd be inclined to mostly just be checking back, some of the more marginal showdown hands than two nines, like, an ace high kind of hand, or mixing in an occasional trap with a 10.
Sure.
But I think for the most part, these kinds of hands, like a pair of nines here, is just going to be almost a little bit too strong to check back. At the very least, like checking back is going to be a low frequency play. I think betting is just going to be the predominant strategy here.
Mm-hmm. I could agree with that it might be the predominant strategy, but I still don't think it's a mandatory bet by any means. I think there's EV.
We can look at what the solver says here. We have the sim.
Yes, that we do. So limitless. Sorry, to go back to the flop or the turn here. We have limitless, slowing down quite a bit. Like checking 70%. I was thinking 70%, around 60, yeah. But the point remains that once we've been called here, you can see that the equity advantage is shifted to the in position player. Now we're still holding roughly a slight advantage in pot share, but the idea is that the in position players' calling range has become more competitive with ours, and we're not interested in just betting all these hand classes too often. So when we do bet, we see a more polar distribution of top end and bottom hands betting, right? The king highs, the queen highs, the jack highs, like we were mentioning, and then the ace highs for the most part going for a check. Victor's specific, hand class of ace eight is kind of doing a little bit of both, but it's not. The EVs are going to be running like quite close between the two strategies, so there's no real preference to what you do other than maybe mixing. Once he checks, we see the big blind yeah, so like this mid hand class, again, playing a mixed strategy, nines, eights, seven, sixes, not mandatory bets because there's EV and checking and reaching the river with some hands that just have decent equity share already. You can bluff catch. Betting for equity denial, aka protection, is reasonable as well. So these two mixed incentives kind of lead us to a mixed strategy. Um, our quads, the only hand class we're like interested in betting every time is quads, which is kind of interesting. Our
Yeah,
full,
just remember if you have quads, it's not a mandatory slow play until the river.
that's right. Yeah, we're gonna bet the weakest parts of our range here. You know, like the suited connectors that have no EV, essentially in the check range. They can get better hands to fold, ace highs, king highs, to put them in different indifference. Yeah, these do a good job of unblocking the Broadway folds. So they're just nice bets. So going back to here, we have Peter who bets. Victor takes a little while with you. You can see in this like I don't know
Yeah,
clock
he's going into his time bank
emoji.
here.
It's
It's a
time bank.
complicated spot.
Yeah, and decides to call, which is um, on the surface difficult to call because you're not beating a lot, but it does make sense from a game theory perspective when we're just looking at this hand in the solver. The imposition player should be turning his suited connectors and some jack highs, queen highs into bluffs now, trying to get him to fold. So ace eight is ahead of all those, so it's kind of makes sense to call here. So I think Victor's call is probably on the threshold, but okay.
I mean, we can see what the solver says, but I think it's going to be fine. Yeah.
Yeah. So we have the threshold here. And if we look at the hand classes of ace high, you can see they're all around indifference, right? But it's important not to just muck them pure because you are still beating all that bluffing region from the imposition player.
Sure.
So he calls. We get the river of seven. This card doesn't really interact with the ranges too much, so it's a relative brick. Victor goes for a check. Peter thinks for a little while, and he decides to go for a value shove for roughly 2/3 pot, which I think is quite good. I mean, it's normal to use a strategy of shoving nines. You can definitely get called by worse. Some of the ace highs are gonna have to call predominantly, probably like ace queen, ace jack, ace king. Will have to mix in some calls. I'm guessing ace king more than the ace jack since you should be bluffing some of your jack highs most likely, so you don't want to block those.
Yeah, it'll be heavily sensitive to that in the sim, whether or not like which types of types of hands are bluffing more on this river as to whether or not ace king versus ace jack likes to hero call more.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Um, Also, if Victor reaches here with hands such as pocket eights that he three bet pre-flop and bet the flop and check called the turn, you can get value from that hand. So I think nines is a pretty clear value shove here, especially when you're only risking 2/3 pot. Like Victor is going to get a decent price to bluff catch, and he has to bluff catch, like fairly wide given this price. Otherwise, your full range that arrives to the river could just profitably bluff all the time if you won't bluff catch thin.
Yeah, I
Uh,
mean, it's definitely probably feels a little bit uncomfortable, maybe for some people to just jam nines here because you are going to sometimes run into a slow played aces or slow
yeah.
played kings, but
Mhm.
it's uh it's going to be good to jam nines here, and you kind of just have to do it more or less.
Yeah, I think the key takeaway is of course Victor can have some of his like strongest pocket pair slow played, but you're not risking a lot given relative to what's in the pot. You're only risking
Right.
21,000 to win the $35,000 pot. So
Right.
even though you will lose at some frequency and value cut yourself, the amount of hands that are still worse that have to call is making up the bulk of his, maybe not the bulk, but a significant part of his range that you can get value from. So I think this is very normal and accurate by Peter to go all in. And Victor tanks for a while and decides on calling. And so you can kind of see it from this perspective right there, right? Nine's got value from ace eight. Ace eight as a bluff call. On the surface, when I first looked at this, it seems like you could just call ace queen and ace king. But the more I look at it, and when we talk about it this way, I think ace eight is kind of nice, like the ace eight or like ace five off or ace six off that he bluffed pre-flop, because you're not really blocking the bluffing region of broadways. So it kind of is nice to call this, leaving all those hands that you can potentially bluff for the imposition player to be in his range. And
It's kind of like we were saying earlier about our ace high catches being very sensitive to being very sensitive to his bluffing region with regards to unblocking it.
yes. So Victor's going to check his full range. And yeah, we can see very much like heavily jamming. And this has to do with your imposition range just has, you have like a pretty big equity advantage with the best hands at the top. There's a little bit of slow play here from sevens and aces, but for the most part, you're just doing really well.
Yeah, and we can jam as thin as 7-6, sixes for value, and it's going to be fine.
Yeah, and this is where it gets, it's getting closer. Like as we look at hands like nines, the EV difference between a check and a jam is pretty significant. As soon as we get down to sixes, we can see it's like very, very close. So this is starting to get in the territory of checking back or betting is kind of equal EV. But yeah, you definitely go quite thin here. And Victor's combo is a pure call. In this solution, it's, as a caveat, it's important to realize that like the ranges of the two players is not exactly like the solver. You might have more ace six here than ace five in reality. Maybe he has less ace nine that he three bet pre-flop. The general takeaway is we want to look at the hand classes, and we can see that the ace highs are kind of different. Ace jack is a bad combo to call with. Ace 10 also was, sorry, ace 10 strips, but ace 9 is not as good. But you see, once we get to ace queen, ace king, we're starting to mix in some calls. Ace 5, ace 8. If he had like a hand like ace 7, probably very similar to a full frequency call, just unblocking the bluffs of the imposition player. These jack 9, queen jacks, 8 9s, some of these king highs. So I think we can summarize pretty accurate play by our buddy Limitless here. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean it's like pretty tough for a human to just find this line with ace 8, but I think it's like a pretty cool that he found it, even though he was wrong and got stacked by a nine, or doubled up the pocket nines.
Awesome. Okay, I think we'll move on to our next hand here that also deals with two regs real quickly. So here we have Linus Love versus Denny something from, looks like Thailand, probably moved there. And then we have Linus fairly infamous high stakes player. It's been around a long time, roughly regarded as one of the best. I don't think he really needs much more of an introduction. What do you think?
No, I think let's just jump into this.
Okay. So we have
So
20K
playing
and out
100,
here, 100,
200.
200. We have small blind, Danielle open raising 3x. We have Linus going for the 9 big blind 3 bet, and Danielle calling with ace king. This is not normally a call per se, but when you're a little bit deeper, it can definitely get in there. Like you can play a little bit of a mixed frequency of ace king, so you're not as capped on the king high boards with a lot of stack remaining. So I don't mind calling this at some frequency. We get a flop
Yeah,
of
it's kind of sorry, I just wanted to say it's not definitely like intuitive to be flatting ace king out of position to a three bet here, but like when you're this deep, it's probably okay. Linus's three bet I think is like completely standard and normal. With a hand like this, we could call a four bet if we have to, so it's not like a huge disaster to three bet and get four bet.
yep.
Seems pretty reasonable, nice to have as a three bet.
Yeah, and I'm sure he's playing this as a mixed frequency 3 bet and sometimes call it, but this time he decides to 3 bet it. Getting to the flop, we have double Broadway with a flush draw, king queen 7. Daniel goes for the check, which is probably what he's going to do with his full range here. Linus decides to go for the small bet, which is fine, but using some larger bets and checks is also a viable strategy. So yeah, I don't really have like a strong feeling towards either strategy, to be honest. I think
No, neither do I would use a bigger bet on this board, but I'm not going to sit here and say that Linus sucks because he bet small.
we went for the small bet, yeah. Daniel decides to call, which is kind of interesting. I think calling has some merit, but going for a check raise is also quite normal, and I would imagine good strategy. Problem with check raising ace king or just top pair in general is the fact that this board is going to change a lot on different runouts with the semi draw texture with 2 hearts and 2 Broadway connected. So when you're very deep, it could get very tricky as the board changes. So calling and keeping the pot under control and not filtering Linus's continuing range too much, is valid and has a lot of merit to it. Anything to add there, Teo?
No, I don't think so. I can't really imagine check raising this hand when we're this deep on such a board. We would need a little bit more going on with it, I think, to find a check raise.
You don't
We
think
could look
that?
at the solver real quick and see.
Yeah. So we have this here brought up already. Daniel checking, Linus going for the third. Yeah, so we see just mixed incentives here.
Yeah, it's mostly we need the ace of hearts, but a little bit as well with no heart as the heartless combo. I
Yeah,
probably wouldn't personally try to find these low frequency raises without a heart. I would mostly just kind of play a little more straightforward and just only check raise without a heart.
yeah. I mean, it seems like a simplification that's decent for a human. Problem is in a game theory sense that if you're only finding the ones with a heart, then yeah, the combinations where the heart completes, you can't turn, uh, or you won't. If you do bet, you'll never be betting the ace king without a heart. Now, is that important because your opponent will never know your exact strategy? You could argue that.
Well, but you're probably not betting ace king without a heart anyway if a heart completes
Hmm. I guess also
this
like
deep,
check
you know?
raising. The good thing about check raising the ace king without a heart is nut flush draws can continue, where if you have the heart, you're less likely to get value from those type of hands.
Sure. Yeah, that's fair. That's a fair point.
That's it's like pretty tough. I mean, we're never gonna play exactly like a solver here. I think the takeaway is you have to make sure you have some ace king within your calling range here, so that you're not too capped as the board changes when there's lots of stack depth still at play. But finding the raise occasionally is like also good. Some good things can happen.
Yep, for sure.
So he does call flop. The turn comes to 8 of hearts, completing the flush. Daniel checks his full range, as I imagine is going to be the strategy. Linus thinks for a little while and then bets 2/3 pot, which is, I think, very accurate because overbetting is not. I wouldn't think it's the predominant strategy here because there's a lot of equalization, and what I mean by that is both players will have flushes, right? And Linus's advantage is in the sets and like mostly in the set advantage and ace ace advantage, and those are hands that are distinctly within his range that Danny does not have. So he kind of wants to build his betting strategy around hands that he has that Danny doesn't. And if he starts betting too large, Danny can just continue with pretty much all the top of his range, where this card is equalized with flushes. So Linus is not really interested in having him play too accurately with his range, so he kind of just goes for this 2/3 sizing to make his single pairs have a difficult time as to whether they should continue or not. Anything you think I'm missing here, Teo?
Yeah, no, like you said, we can't go too big, and I think 2/3 just for all the reasons you stated makes a lot of sense as our dominant strategy.
Okay, awesome. Daniel makes the call, which is, I think, probably mandatory. It's unfortunate that you're facing a heart, but versus this size, you should still be winning enough. Linus still has some bluffs, right? Like ace jack, ace 10, ace 10 suited, 9/10, single heart combos of offsuit ace x region that you're unblocking by not having a heart. So I mean, it's just a pure continue. We can see if Roos agrees with us here. So we have a 8 of hearts comes. Linus goes for the 2/3, which is Roos's preferred single sizing. And again, that has to do with the fact that there's a lot of symmetry at the top of the range where both players will have lots of heart combos, and Linus's advantage is kind of in this, 60 to 70% equity range here. So going back, he decides to go for a bet, which is completely fine. And most of his like flush classes, as the imposition player, are interested in betting. He's just checking back some of the weaker ones that are not interested.
Interestingly, it likes to check behind when it has a 7. For some reason, this particular 7 with the heart, it continues to bet.
Yes, that is a interesting find. Not 100% sure what's happening here. I think this is mostly has to specifically do with how Roos is very specifically constructing his ranges between both players and his blocker effects. I don't think we're going to get too bogged down with that. It's also not really practical to try to discern this in real game, considering your opponent's range will not be exactly like Roos's. So the main takeaway here is that we're interested in betting all our strong flushes and then checking back sometimes with the weaker flushes that potentially could be dominated by a higher flush. 6, 7, 5, 4, probably a little bit rare exceptions because they block a lot of suited hands that have a 6 or a 5 or 4 associated with them that Danny was defending out of position. So we get this bet. We see ace king as a pure call, and that has to do again
Quite
with,
a bit of EV as well. It's not as a
no, it's not a close decision. Linus is supposed to be bluffing, you know, low pairs. Like I was saying, these offsuit ace x with a heart, and you're just beating all those hands, and you unblock it by not holding a heart with your ace king. So you're just, it's just a mandatory defend. Get a call, and the river is going to come in 8. 8 of spades. Then L checks. Linus tanks for a little bit and then decides to bet again, like 2/3ish. 3/4. I don't see a problem with the sizing. I think by the river when the 8 comes, the interesting thing is Linus has a distinct hand class that Daniel does not have. He has pocket queens, pocket kings for full house. So it is reasonable that you want to split your range here into 2 sizes. So you could have this size like Linus did with, you know, your flushes, for instance. Maybe as thin as top 2 pair. And those hands are not interesting going all in. And then having an all in size with, you know, your full houses at this point. So pocket kings, pocket queens, even pocket sevens. And you can turn your hands into a bluff for an all in size. Maybe something holding a 7 like a7 suited can go for all in. It's not 100% clear to me how the range should be split perfectly, but I think 2 sizes does make sense here. Teo,
I think 2 sizes is fairly mandatory as well, but do you think that the all-in size should really just be a full house only, or do you think we can jam some nut flushes as well?
That's an interesting point. Maybe the nut flush can also jam. The only concern I have with that is when the board pairs, does he have to call worse flushes now with the board pairing other than a nut flush?
I think almost certainly, yeah. I think almost certainly, and he'll also probably have to make some calls with that are not flushes as well. I think he's gonna have to make some calls like, you know, well, maybe if he had ace king with the ace of hearts, although then he blocks our nut flush, so we're not gonna get called by that hand. But you know, I think it's possible that he could call down with you know, some one pair hand with a heart and then maybe okay call downs versus a jam because they'll block our full houses as well.
Could be right. Yeah, it's unclear to me. Maybe we'll see how Roos wants to play this river. So we have then small blind checking full range, which makes sense. He's at a big disadvantage. He's not interested in leading out, donking. And yeah, we can see that Roos wants to split its range into 2 sizes. Wants to play an all in, and it wants to play actually this 2/3 bet like Linus did. So quads, sure, it's gonna go all in. You don't have it. Our full houses are mainly interested in going all in, mixing in the smaller size for deception. Our flushes, you are right, Dale. The nut flush is still interested in, for the most part, going for stacks. But
yeah, it looks like some of the nut flushes can still jam. Yeah.
But the weaker flushes, for the most part, can't. Although you have like some combos that can play a mixed strategy. To me, I'm not really interested in doing that. I think I would just jam nut flush and boats, and just play these as the regular 2/3. I think the visibility of that strategy is very low in a node. When you reach this node, that's not frequent. And no made hand regions are going to be, yeah, suited connectors that missed. These can be very difficult to do as a human with no heart blocker, just pure 5/6, pure 5/4.
Just fired off with this, yeah.
Yeah, this is why most humans in this spot will be under bluffing, because they just will not have these complete air balls on a flush paired board to bluff. These other ones here, like the ones with heart, the nut blocker, these make quite a bit of sense to bluff with the ace of hearts. These are a little bit more intuitive.
Yeah, these ones are easier to find, but the 6-5 of clubs is
Yeah, that's a tough one.
that's a tough one.
Yeah, I think even for a player,
If he does jam, what kind of hands does out of position need to call with? Just out of curiosity.
yeah. So we were saying that he might have to call some flushes. So looks like you're right. He's kind of indifferent to bluff catch with some of these flushes. It's very
Yeah,
block,
he's
super blocker dependent here. Where if you hold certain combos that he is no longer value jamming, then you calling just runs into a boat too often, and you're just losing way too much EV, like ace 10 for instance, blocking his worst flush jams, as we saw the 10-3 of hearts and stuff like that. So now you're just running into a boat so much more often and losing, where a hand like ace 3 that unblocks it, or ace 4 can profitably call. the the majority of like the pure air bluff catchers though are going to be second pair and top pair, right? Blocking full houses.
yeah, like king queen. You can see is a really nice call down because we
For sure.
just
Real.
have those kings and queens so blocked.
Yeah, absolutely.
And yeah, you feel really wrecked when he like shows you a nut flush and you call down with that hand, but
Yep.
that's kind of just how the game works sometimes.
Yeah. That's just how the game goes sometimes. You don't have to defend very often. You're allowed to fold a lot versus the all in, but like even this ace king, you know what I mean? Like some combos are heavily losing, but there's a few that you can kind of call, but
Yeah,
practically.
having ace king with a heart is actually bad in
Mm-hmm.
this node, like
Yes.
because you just block the bluffs.
Yeah, as we just saw from the other player,
That's interesting to think about.
he's bluffing these heart blockers with the ace, right? So if you're holding ace king blocking them, then you're blocking a big portion of the bluffs. Linus goes for the 67%, which is, you know, very predominant as well. And our threshold here is going to be, yeah, a lot of top pairs. Ace king, not holding a heart again, very important. So you can be bluffing those ace x with the ace of heart. King queens, nice call or a nice bluff jam even. So you're surrendering your showdown EV and turning your hand into a bluff because of its very distinct properties of probably making nut flushes indifferent. So if Linus puts some of his nut 2/3 nut flush or good flushes into this bet, if you jam king queen, they're only bluff catchers. So that's really sweet. And yeah, everything else is pretty normal. You're gonna just jam the top of your range, of course. Second pairs can turn themselves into all three options. You can fold them because they're kind of indifferent between bluff catching. They have some good properties to call, and they have some good properties to turn themselves into a bluff. Again, unblocking flushes and blocking full houses. In our hand example, we had Danny decide to call, which I think is well played.
Which is going to be the preferred action with this hand.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. So
As with a lot of these hands, all you can really do after is just kind of look at both players and say, "Well done."
yeah, I think both players played this situation quite accurately. Yeah, so I think we're gonna call it. We've been going for 45 minutes here. We'll call it here.
Yeah, I think that's enough time.
I hope you guys enjoyed it. If there's anything you'd like to see us cover, leave comments in the description below. If there's anything you think we can
Leave a comment
improve,
anyway, regardless, even if there's not.
yeah, that's right. Please like and subscribe. Yeah, if there's anything else that you think we can improve on, if you like maybe hearing music in the background faintly, let us know. We can always add that. Other than that, thanks for tuning in, and I hope this was informative and that you got something out of it. So from Kaizen Poker Group here, we'd like to thank you for watching, and see you later.